So now what we want to do is take a look at this question of, are states inevitable? Is the state system that we know today the only way that we could organize international relations, or the only way that we could think about how one group of people relate to another? To do that, let's think about this in a couple of different ways. First, by thinking about non-states, things that happen before states or maybe alternative to states. And then second, by also thinking about what forces might challenge the state or may challenge state sovereignty. So if we think about other options to the states, let's think about some alternatives. First of all, let's consider to what degree are the fundamental characteristics of the state, like internal hierarchy or fixed boundaries, necessary in order to organize politics. There are a couple of different ways that we could think about organizing the system if we're willing to relax these assumptions. One way would be to rearrange hierarchy or to rearrange boundaries into something that is a little bit more decentralized. So think about something like a city-state, similar to what you might have seen in Italy in the 1500s or in the 1600s. For the city-state, you have a fixed urban boundary, maybe a walled city, but it's not so easy to figure out where city control ends and begins. How far into the countryside can one specific city control? And you might find that those boundaries might be a little bit flexible. Another way would be to take these city-states and think about them in some type of a confederal arrangement. Under a confederal system, you could have a group of these cities agreeing to a common defense or a common trading league, and yet each one of the cities maintains their own internal autonomy. So a lack of hierarchy that you would expect to see in a state. In another example, or rather in either of these examples, the sources of power or the sovereignty that we would think of as being part of the states would be more unstable than what it is today. It would be less stable because cities may enter or drop out of the league, or it may be unstable because the boundaries between cities may start to shift. Another way we could think about this would be to think about something like a feudal system or a monarchical system that might have existed in Europe from about 1000 to about 15 or 1600 AD. In the feudal system, rulers of one land may very well be the vassals of another, as we've already mentioned. Now, what this means is that power is effectively distributed by patronage. So I give you power that belongs to me so you can govern the lands, which then in turn you pay me for in some way. In this arrangement, the actual center of power for any given area can easily shift, either through a rearrangement of the vassal system or through death, or territories may be traded and change hands. Now, what's interesting in thinking about these four different options is that in actuality, these didn't die out. They just became less popular. We may live in a state system, but examples of each of these forms of states still exist today. Think of countries like Monaco or Liechtenstein or Singapore, or even consider something like the United Arab Emirates, the UAE. With each of these, what we're really seeing is something much more like a city-state or an urban league system than the modern state system. Also consider how power is distributed in a country like Japan versus a country like North Korea. What we see in North Korea is something that's much more like a patrimonial patronage system than the modern state system today. So now that we've thought about rivals to the states, let's ask the question a little bit differently, and let's talk about whether or not states are perfect. We mentioned earlier that in order to have a state, one of the things that you have to have is this idea of state sovereignty, of non-intervention. The problem is, this question of sovereignty is a little bit more complex, a little bit more complicated than most people give it credit for. In 1999, a political scientist named Stephen Krasner wrote a very well-received examination of sovereignty, where he broke sovereignty down into four basic types or categories. By thinking about sovereignty as being complex, it's then possible for us to realize that it isn't perfect. And so let's take a look at some of these examples. First of all, let's consider this idea of domestic sovereignty. Domestic sovereignty is organization of public control, or the effectiveness of that control. One of the key assumptions of both democracy and capitalism is that the state must surrender some degree of effective control, that somehow or to some level the people control themselves, or that the markets are in control, or that international entities through trade might be in control. Either way, we might not necessarily see perfect domestic sovereignty. The same is also true with something else called interdependence. Interdependence refers to this idea that states don't exist independent of one another, and there are going to be these trans-border movements of people through migration, or of capital, or of goods and services. If you have interdependent sovereignty, what this means is that a state has complete control of the flow of these goods and capital, or that it can challenge at any time the migration of goods and trade across its borders. Now, the problem is almost all states have some level of illegal migration or some degree of black market forces where goods and people enter the state without necessarily having state permission. With national or legal sovereignty, what we're talking about is mutual recognition of states. And this seems to be an accepted norm. The United States recognizes Canada. But think about a situation like Sudan versus South Sudan, or maybe Yugoslavia, where you have an existing state that begins to fall apart. And you have to have the other states in the system wrestle with the idea of when and how do we recognize the shrinking of this state and the addition of new ones to the system. And then finally, we should also consider this idea of Westphalian sovereignty, which is where we started. This idea that states are excluded from each other, that if I am in charge of one state, I don't interfere in the actions of another. Now the problem is, if you look simply as far back as America's relationship with Iraq or its involvement in Syria, you don't have to go too far to begin to wonder whether or not Westphalian sovereignty actually exists. Do countries really stay out of each other's business? So what we have here is a list of possible threats or rivals or challenges to the state sovereignty. Things like personal freedom or internal rivals, external occupation, non-state actors, whatever. These threats to the state can come from a number of sources. So to conclude, I want to ask you a question, or I want you to think about a question. Think about this idea of whether or not the United States is actually, in fact, sovereign. Right? Go through the list of characteristics. To what degree is our sovereignty, our stateness, compromised? I mean, to be sure, we are a state, but what about public debate over things like wiretapping or email monitoring? Does or even can the United States establish effective controls over its own borders or its own boundaries? Would it be possible to build something like a border fence? And even if we did, would that completely halt the flow of illegal immigrants into the country? Does the United States have complete control over its own currency? Or has globalization somehow threatened that control? And perhaps more importantly, does this even matter? Are there places, even in the United States, where what is good for the state isn't necessarily good for the people? And if so, are we willing to tolerate a certain amount of compromise to the state and the state concept?